What if I told you that the most elegant image of the Victorian era, those sweeping ball gowns, those tiny waists, those ladies who seemed to float through drawing rooms like ethereal beings, was actually built on a foundation of daily physical torture, elaborate deception, and bathroom logistics so complicated they would make a NASA engineer weep? We look at those sepia photographs, those romantic paintings of women in clouds of silk and lace, and we see refinement. We see a golden age of manners and morality. But beneath those magnificent gowns that could span 6 feet in diameter lay a reality so uncomfortable, so undignified, so carefully hidden that it was never spoken of in polite society, yet consumed hours of every woman's day. The Victorian lady with her 18-inch waist and her skirts that required doorways to be navigated sideways faced a challenge that modern people can barely comprehend. How do you use the toilet when you're wearing 40 pounds of clothing, trapped inside a cage of steel hoops, and laced so tightly into a corset that bending at the waist becomes physically impossible? The answer reveals not just the ingenuity of desperate women, but the profound cruelty of a society that valued appearance over basic human dignity, that turned the simple act of relieving oneself into an elaborate performance requiring assistance, special equipment, and skills that took years to master. This is not the story of elegant ladies sipping tea in sun-dappled conservatories. This is the story of biological warfare waged against women's own bodies, of fashion as a form of imprisonment, and of the shocking engineering solutions that made survival possible in an impossible world. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Impossibility. Step into a Victorian bedroom on a winter morning in 1863. The air is sharp with cold, carrying the acrid bite of coal smoke from the previous night's fires. Frost covers the windows in delicate patterns that would be beautiful if they didn't represent the bone-deep chill that pervades the room. A woman, let's call her Eleanor, sits at her dressing table while her lady's maid begins the daily ritual of construction. Because that's what dressing a Victorian woman truly was. Not putting on clothes, but assembling an architectural marvel around a human body. The process begins with the chemise, a thin cotton or linen shift that clings to the skin, designed to absorb the sweat that will inevitably accumulate as the day progresses. The fabric feels rough against skin already goose-bumped from the cold. Then comes the corset, and here we must pause to understand what this device actually was. This was not the flexible, comfortable undergarment of modern imagination. This was a piece of structural engineering, reinforced with whalebone or steel stays, designed to reshape the human torso into an idealized form that bore little resemblance to natural anatomy. As the maid pulls the laces tight, Eleanor feels her floating ribs compress inward. Her stomach is forced down, her liver pushed upward, her lungs squeezed until their capacity is reduced by nearly a third. The corset creates a rigid cylinder from bust to hips, making it impossible to bend at the waist. The simple act of leaning forward, essential for using a modern toilet, becomes physically impossible. Eleanor is now a living statue from the torso up, able to move her arms and legs, but unable to bend her spine. But the corset is merely the foundation for what comes next, the crinoline. In the 1850s, this revolutionary invention replaced the 6 or 7 heavy petticoats that women had previously worn to achieve the fashionable bell-shaped silhouette. The crinoline was a cage of concentric steel hoops connected by vertical tapes, creating a framework that could extend up to 6 feet in diameter. While lighter than the layers of fabric it replaced, it transformed the woman into a walking architectural structure, a mobile monument to wealth and status that announced her presence before she even entered a room. Over this steel framework went a petticoat to smooth the lines, then perhaps another petticoat with elaborate ruffles to enhance the hem's movement. Then came the underskirt, the overskirt, and finally the bodice, each layer adding weight and complexity. By the time Eleanor is fully dressed, she is wearing between 20 and 40 pounds of clothing. She occupies a space 3 times the size of her actual body. She cannot fit through doorways without turning sideways, cannot sit without careful maneuvering to prevent the cage from flying up in her face, and cannot see her own feet. Now imagine this woman needs to use the toilet. The very thought seems absurd, doesn't it? How could someone encased in such elaborate armor possibly manage something so fundamentally simple? The answer lies not in what Victorian women wore, but in what they strategically didn't wear, and in the elaborate choreography they developed to navigate their beautiful prisons. Picture Eleanor at an afternoon tea party, the drawing room warm with bodies and heated by a coal fire that fills the air with a faint haze. She has been sipping tea for 2 hours, making polite conversation about the weather and the latest novels. But now she feels the familiar pressure building in her bladder. In our modern world, she would simply excuse herself, walk to a bathroom, and return within minutes. But for Eleanor, this simple biological need represents a complex logistical challenge that will require assistance, special equipment, and physical maneuvers that would challenge a circus performer. The first obstacle is social. Victorian etiquette strictly forbade any direct reference to bodily functions. A proper lady never admitted to needing the toilet. Instead, she might murmur about needing to refresh herself or adjust her dress, euphemisms that everyone understood but no one acknowledged directly. Even these indirect requests were considered somewhat vulgar, signs of poor breeding or weak character. The ideal Victorian woman was supposed to transcend such earthly concerns, to exist on a higher plane than ordinary biological reality. But biology doesn't care about social pretensions, and the pressure in Eleanor's bladder continues to build as she smiles and nods through another conversation about the virtues of charitable work among the poor. She knows that she has perhaps an hour before the discomfort becomes unbearable, before she risks the ultimate social catastrophe, an accident that would stain her dress and announce to the world that she is, after all, merely human. How did Victorian women survive this daily challenge? The answer reveals a hidden world of ingenious solutions, intimate conspiracies between women, and physical endurance that would astonish modern people. But to understand their survival strategies, we must first meet the invisible army that made Victorian femininity possible. Chapter 2. The Secret Engineering of Survival. Before Eleanor even opens her eyes each morning, another woman has been awake for hours. Mary moves through the servants' corridors on bare feet that have learned to navigate the cold stone floors without making a sound. She carries a jug of hot water in one hand and a porcelain chamber pot in the other, the latter concealed beneath a cloth that doesn't quite hide its unmistakable shape. The air in these back passages is thick with the smell of coal smoke, lye soap, and something else. Something sour and organic that no amount of carbolic acid can completely eliminate. Mary is a lady's maid, one of the countless women whose invisible labor maintains the illusion of effortless Victorian elegance. In part of that labor, the part never mentioned in the household manuals or etiquette books, is managing the waste produced by bodies that society pretends don't exist. In a world without modern plumbing, where even the wealthiest homes rely on chamber pots and primitive water closets, Mary begins each day by collecting the evidence of her employer's humanity and making it disappear. The chamber pots she carries are heavy porcelain vessels, often beautifully decorated with roses or pastoral scenes to disguise their base purpose. They fit inside specially designed furniture called commodes, pieces that look like innocent chairs or small cabinets but open to reveal their true function. These commodes were engineered with Victorian woman's fashion in mind, designed with enough space around them to accommodate the enormous circumference of a crinoline skirt. But here's where we encounter the first shocking secret of Victorian intimate wear. The solution to the toilet problem lay not in the elaborate outer garments, but in a strategic omission in the undergarments. If you were to examine a pair of Victorian women's drawers in a museum, you would notice something that modern sensibilities find scandalous. They were open at the crotch. These split drawers consisted of two separate legs joined only at the waistband. The crotch seam was left entirely open, with the fabric simply overlapping to provide coverage when standing still, but parting easily when the legs were separated. This wasn't about sexuality or ease of access for others. It was pure practicality, born of desperate necessity. Once a woman was fully dressed in her layers of skirts, petticoats, and crinoline, she could not undress. There were no zippers, no elastic waistbands, no simple fastenings. To remove standard closed underwear would require removing the entire ensemble, a process that could take 30 minutes and the assistance of a maid. The split drawers allowed a woman to relieve herself without removing a single layer of clothing. But knowing this mechanism is only half the story. The execution required skills that took years to master, and often assistance from servants who became intimate witnesses to their employer's most private moments. When Eleanor signals her need to retire, Mary understands immediately. They move to Eleanor's dressing room or to a screened corner of the bedroom where a commode waits. But Eleanor cannot simply sit down like a modern person using a toilet. If she sits on the low chamber pot, her steel crinoline will hit the floor before she does, pushing the hoops upward and potentially exposing her to anyone who might enter the room. The cage that gives her dress its magnificent shape becomes a mechanical obstacle that must be carefully managed. Instead, Eleanor must perform a complex maneuver that requires balance, coordination, and considerable thigh strength. She positions herself over the chamber pot and assumes a standing straddle, her feet planted wide apart. Mary helps by lifting the back of the heavy crinoline, creating clearance between the steel hoops and the floor. The split drawers part as Eleanor widens her stance, and she relieves herself while hovering over the porcelain ball, maintaining her balance through sheer muscle control. The entire process is a carefully choreographed dance, performed in near silence. Eleanor cannot afford to make noise. The sounds might carry through the walls and betray her humanity to other guests. Mary must position herself to provide assistance while averting her eyes just enough to give her mistress the illusion of privacy she doesn't actually have. The intimacy of this relationship is staggering to modern minds. Mary knows the smell of her mistress, the timing of her cycles, the color of her urine. She is the keeper of secrets that could destroy Eleanor's social standing if they were ever revealed. After Eleanor finishes, Mary provides whatever cleaning materials are available, perhaps scraps of soft paper, strips of cloth, or sponges soaked in vinegar water for the wealthy. But Eleanor, rigid in her corset and trapped in her cage of fabric, cannot twist or bend to clean herself. In many cases, this intimate task also falls to the maid, making Mary not just a witness, but a participant in her mistress's most private bodily functions. The chamber pot is then whisked away, its contents to be emptied into larger containers, or, in more modern homes, primitive sewage systems. But the evidence of the act, the slight dampness in the air, the faint ammonia scent that clings to fabric, must be managed as well. Heavy perfumes, burning pastilles, and opened windows all serve to mask the reality that everyone knows, but no one acknowledges. This system works within the controlled environment of the home, where servants maintain the infrastructure of pots and privacy, where rooms can be secured and sounds muffled. But what happens when Eleanor ventures into the public world, where such elaborate support systems are unavailable and the social stakes are even higher? Chapter 3: The Public Performance of Denial. The public world of Victorian society presented challenges that made the private difficulties of home seem almost manageable. When Eleanor's carriage pulls up to the opera house for an evening performance, she faces a trial that will test not just her physical endurance, but her ability to maintain the elaborate fiction that her body doesn't exist. The performance she's about to attend will last 4 hours. But her real performance, the one that matters for her social survival, began the moment she left home. Victorian cities were designed by and for men. Public urinals dotted the streets of London and Paris, providing convenient relief for gentlemen who could step off the sidewalk and attend to their needs with relative discretion. But for women, the public infrastructure simply didn't exist. This created what historians call the urinary leash. Women could only travel as far from home as their bladders would allow. The absence of facilities wasn't an oversight, it was a feature of a society that preferred women to remain in domestic spaces where their bodily needs could be managed privately. Before leaving home for any extended social engagement, Eleanor engaged in elaborate preparation that would be familiar to any modern person who has ever faced a long journey without bathroom access, but magnified by the constraints of her clothing and the social impossibility of asking for relief. She restricted her fluid intake for hours beforehand, sometimes to the point of mild dehydration. She used her chamber pot multiple times before dressing, attempting to empty her bladder as completely as possible. Some Victorian women trained themselves like athletes, building up their bladder capacity and control through sheer necessity, learning to go 8 or 10 hours without relief. At the Opera House, Eleanor navigates the crowded lobby with careful steps, her enormous skirts requiring constant attention to avoid catching on furniture or other patrons' clothing. The air is thick with gas fumes from the newly installed lighting, mixed with the heavy perfumes that every woman wears not just for beauty, but to mask the various odors that accumulate under layers of wool and silk. The building is heated by coal fires that make the air close and stifling, and Eleanor is already beginning to perspire beneath her corset, though she cannot show any sign of discomfort. The opera begins, and Eleanor settles into her seat with the careful maneuvering required to prevent her crinoline from flying up. The music is magnificent, the voice is soaring, but as the first act progresses, Eleanor becomes increasingly aware of the pressure building in her bladder. She has been careful with her tea consumption, but the champagne at dinner and the glass of wine during the intermission are making their presence known. She shifts slightly in her seat, trying to find a position that relieves the pressure, but the rigid corset makes any significant movement impossible. By the second act, Eleanor's discomfort has progressed from awareness to active distraction. She tries to focus on the drama unfolding on stage, but her mind keeps returning to the growing urgency in her lower abdomen. The corset, already tight around her compressed organs, seems to squeeze more insistently with each breath. She glances around the theater, noting other women who sit with the same rigid posture, the same carefully controlled expressions. How many of them are fighting the same battle? During the intermission, Eleanor faces a choice that will determine whether she can endure the remaining 2 hours of performance. She could attempt to find relief, but this requires navigating a complex social and logistical challenge. First, she must signal her need without stating it directly, perhaps mentioning to her companion that she wishes to powder her nose or adjust her gloves. Then she must locate whatever facilities the theater provides, which in most cases means a small retiring room with a chamber pot, if anything at all. But even if such a room exists, Eleanor faces the same mechanical challenges she encounters at home, but now, without Mary's assistance, and in an unfamiliar space. She must perform the complex maneuver of positioning herself over a chamber pot while managing her enormous skirts, all while trying to remain as quiet as possible, since other women may be waiting outside the door. The risk of an accident, of missing the pot or soiling her dress, is catastrophic in this public setting. Many women chose instead to endure, developing a kind of stoic tolerance for discomfort that became a mark of breeding and character. They learned to breathe shallowly to avoid putting pressure on their compressed organs, to shift their weight subtly to relieve the strain on their bladders, to maintain pleasant expressions while experiencing genuine physical distress. The fainting couch became a fixture of Victorian social spaces, not just for women overcome by emotion, but for those whose combination of tight corsets and full bladders caused their blood pressure to spike and their consciousness to waver. For those who couldn't endure, Victorian ingenuity provided a solution that seems almost incredible to modern minds: the Bordelot. Named after a French priest whose sermons were supposedly so long that ladies needed portable relief, this device was essentially a small, boat-shaped chamber pot designed to be used while seated. Made of porcelain and often decorated with delicate patterns, it could be concealed beneath the vast expanse of a crinoline skirt and used discreetly even in semi-public spaces. Picture the scene. Eleanor, unable to leave her theater box during a crucial aria, signals to her maid who has been waiting in the corridor. The maid slips into the box during a particularly dramatic musical passage and, under cover of the enormous crinoline, slides the Bordelot into position. Eleanor, still appearing to watch the performance with rapt attention, adjusts her position slightly, and relieves herself into the hidden vessel. The entire transaction takes place in full view of hundreds of other operagoers, yet remains completely invisible thanks to the architecture of her dress. The risks were enormous. One slip of the hand, one unexpected movement, and the contents of the bordelot could spill onto Eleanor's dress, creating a stain and odor that would announce her shame to everyone around her. The social death would be immediate and complete. Yet thousands of women took these risks rather than endure the alternative of hours of increasing agony. But the challenges of public life extended beyond the immediate need for relief. The very act of wearing such elaborate clothing in public spaces created constant anxiety about exposure, about the mechanical failures that could reveal more than was socially acceptable. And lurking beneath all these concerns was an even darker reality, one that turned the beautiful gowns into potential death traps. Chapter 4. The Price of Beauty in Blood and Fire. We must now venture into the darkest corners of the Victorian wardrobe, where beauty and death walked hand in hand through the drawing rooms of the wealthy. The challenges we have discussed so far, the difficulty of using chamber pots, the social anxiety of public events, the elaborate engineering required for basic bodily functions, were merely the daily inconveniences of Victorian femininity. But there were darker realities lurking beneath those magnificent gowns, consequences so severe that they literally killed thousands of women, yet were accepted as simply the price of being fashionable. The first of these hidden horrors was fire. The materials that created the ethereal beauty of Victorian fashion, cotton muslins, silk gauzes, and lightweight fabrics that caught the light so beautifully, were also highly flammable. The crinoline, that cage of steel hoops that made women so magnificent and so helpless, turned them into walking tinderboxes. When combined with the open fires that heated Victorian homes, the candles that provided romantic lighting, and the gas jets of early indoor illumination, women's clothing became a constant fire hazard. Crinoline fires were a genuine epidemic of the mid-19th century. Newspapers regularly reported deaths of women whose skirts had caught fire, often while they were engaged in the most mundane activities. The mechanics of using a chamber pot, backing up to the vessel, lifting the rear of the enormous skirt, positioning oneself carefully, often took place near bedroom fires for warmth and light. As a woman lifted the back of her crinoline, the front would swing forward. If she was too close to the fireplace, the hem could catch a spark or brush against a coal that had fallen from the grate. Once ignited, the crinoline became a furnace. The steel hoops held the burning fabric away from the woman's body, creating a chimney effect that fed air to the flames while making it impossible for her to smother the fire by rolling on the ground. The cage that had made her so elegant now trapped her in a cylinder of fire. Women burned to death in their own bedrooms, in their drawing rooms, at social gatherings, their screams echoing through houses where moments before there had been only the quiet rustle of silk and the gentle murmur of conversation. The medical consequences of Victorian fashion extended far beyond the immediate danger of fire. The tight lacing of corsets, which could reduce a woman's waist to 18 inches or less, compressed internal organs in ways that caused permanent damage. The liver was pushed upward, the stomach compressed, the intestines displaced. Women suffered chronic digestive problems, unable to eat normal meals because their stomachs had been squeezed into unnatural positions. The lungs, compressed by the rigid stays, couldn't expand fully, leading to shallow breathing and frequent fainting spells. But perhaps most relevant to our investigation is how the corset affected the organs involved in elimination. The bladder and kidneys, already under pressure from the steel stays, were further stressed by the forced retention that Victorian social life demanded. Chronic urinary tract infections were endemic among fashionable women, though these were rarely discussed openly. The toxins that should have been flushed regularly from the body were held for hours, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth and kidney damage. The practice of dehydration, deliberately limiting fluid intake to avoid the inconvenience of needing relief during social events, compounded these problems. Women regularly experienced headaches, fatigue, and kidney stones as a result of chronic dehydration. Some developed permanent kidney damage from years of forcing their bodies to retain waste for the sake of social convenience. And then there was menstruation, the ultimate taboo of Victorian society. We have discussed the challenges of urination in elaborate dress, but the monthly reality of menstrual bleeding presented even greater difficulties. Victorian women had no access to modern sanitary products. No tampons, no adhesive pads, no disposable protection. Instead, they relied on clouts or rags, strips of absorbent fabric that had to be pinned or tied into place. But pinned to what? Remember the split drawers with their open crotch. There was no underwear to attach a pad to. Women had to construct elaborate suspension systems, belts worn under the corset, from which the rags were hung between the legs. These makeshift arrangements were bulky, uncomfortable, and unreliable. The fear of leakage was constant, made worse by the fact that Victorian ball gowns could cost the equivalent of a year's wages for a middle-class family. To stain such a dress was not just embarrassing, it was financially catastrophic. The white and pale-colored fabrics favored for evening wear showed every stain. Women lived in terror of the telltale brown or red spots that would announce to the world that they were, after all, merely human animals, subject to the indignities of biology. They doused themselves in heavy perfumes, not just to smell pleasant, but to mask the odors of blood, sweat, and the various bodily functions that accumulated under layers of fabric that were rarely washed. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was enormous. Victorian women learned to see their own bodies as sources of shame and anxiety. They were taught that their natural functions were disgusting, that any acknowledgement of their physical needs was a sign of poor breeding. The very act of menstruation, a normal, healthy biological process, became a monthly ordeal of fear and concealment. The servants who maintained this elaborate deception paid their own price. The laundry maids who washed the blood-stained rags, the ladies' maids who helped with the intimate mechanics of elimination, the scullery maids who emptied and cleaned the chamber pots. These women handled the biological reality that their employers refused to acknowledge. They breathed the ammonia fumes, scrubbed the stains, and carried the waste, all while maintaining the fiction that such things didn't exist in polite society. The class dynamics of Victorian toilet habits reveal the profound inequalities of the era. Wealthy women suffered in their beautiful cages, but they had servants to help them manage the mechanical challenges, private rooms with chamber pots, and the luxury of multiple changes of clothing. Working-class women faced the same biological needs, but with none of the support systems. They worked in factories and shops while wearing simplified versions of fashionable dress, trying to manage their bodily functions in shared privies, public facilities that were often little more than holes in the ground. The urban environment of Victorian cities made these challenges even more severe. The streets reeked of horse manure, coal smoke, and human waste from overflowing sewers. Public toilets for women were virtually non-existent until the very end of the century. A working woman who needed relief during her long day had few options beyond the filthy shared facilities in her tenement building or the dubious privacy of an alley or courtyard. Yet even in these harsh conditions, women found ways to maintain dignity and support each other. They shared information about which public houses had cleaner facilities, which employers allowed reasonable breaks, which streets had fewer men likely to harass a woman seeking privacy. They developed their own networks of mutual aid, helping each other manage the practical challenges of being female in a world designed for male convenience. The question that haunts this entire investigation is why women accepted such conditions. What kept them trapped in clothing that endangered their health, in social systems that denied their basic humanity, in a world that valued their appearance more than their comfort or safety? Chapter 5. The Cage of Respectability. The elaborate suffering we have documented, the mechanical challenges of using chamber pots in enormous dresses, the health consequences of tight lacing and forced retention, The constant anxiety about fires and stains and social exposure was not an accidental byproduct of Victorian fashion. It was in many ways the point. The clothing that made simple activities nearly impossible served a deeper purpose in Victorian society. It rendered women decorative, dependent, and controllable. A woman who needed assistance to dress, who couldn't easily move through space, who had to carefully plan every outing around the limitations of her clothing and her body, was a woman who couldn't easily exist independently. The economics of Victorian women's fashion made this control explicit. The elaborate dresses, the multiple layers, the constant need for assistance from ladies' maids. All of this required significant wealth. A woman in a crinoline announced to the world that she didn't need to work, that her family could afford to keep her as an ornamental dependent. The very impracticality of the clothing was a status symbol, visible proof that this woman existed purely for decoration and reproduction, not for labor or productivity. Working-class women couldn't afford such elaborate dress and couldn't have performed their jobs while wearing it. The fashion literally divided women by class, marking the boundaries between those who worked and those who were worked for. The lady in her drawing room, struggling to manage her bodily functions while maintaining perfect posture, was as much a prisoner of her class as the maid who helped her, though their prisons took different forms. The tight lacing of corsets served a similar function of control. Victorian doctors, all male, as women were largely excluded from medical education, debated the health effects of corsets with passionate intensity. Some warned of compressed organs and respiratory problems, while others insisted that women's bodies required external support to function properly. But the medical debate missed the larger point. Corsets made women fragile, made them need to sit down frequently, made them unable to engage in vigorous activity. A woman in a tightly laced corset couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't do physical labor. She was rendered helpless by her own clothing, dependent on men for protection and support. The difficulties of managing toilet functions in such clothing added another layer to this system of control. Women had to plan their activities around their bodily needs, had to remain close to home or to trusted spaces where facilities were available and assistance could be provided. They couldn't easily travel alone, couldn't spend long days away from home without suffering. The clothing created an invisible leash, keeping women tethered to domestic spaces and dependent on the infrastructure of servants and facilities that only wealth could provide. The silence surrounding bodily functions served its own purpose in this system of control. By making it improper to discuss such matters, Victorian society ensured that women couldn't share solutions, couldn't complain about the difficulties, couldn't collectively organize to demand better conditions. Each woman faced her challenges alone, believing that her struggles were personal failings rather than systemic problems designed to keep her dependent and controlled. The shame attached to bodily functions kept women isolated in their suffering, prevented them from recognizing that their difficulties were shared and were caused by the social structures imposed upon them rather than by any inadequacy of their own. A woman who had an accident, who couldn't endure a long social event without needing relief, who showed any sign that she possessed a functioning digestive or urinary system, was marked as somehow deficient in breeding and character. Yet women weren't entirely passive victims of this system. They developed remarkable ingenuity in working within its constraints, creating solutions that allowed them to survive and even thrive despite the obstacles placed in their path. They invented the split drawers that made toilet use possible without complete undressing. They designed hinged bustles that could fold up when sitting. They created portable chamber pots and taught each other techniques for managing enormous skirts with grace and efficiency. They built networks of mutual support that operated entirely outside male awareness, a hidden feminine society within the larger society, built on shared understanding of challenges that men never had to face. A hostess would ensure that chamber pots were available and rooms were accessible without being asked. An older woman would subtly guide a younger one toward facilities before she had to make an embarrassing request. Women would time their own departures from social gatherings to provide cover for another woman's exit. Some women went further, becoming vocal critics of restrictive fashion and advocates for dress reform. The dress reform movement that emerged in the mid-Victorian era included women who argued publicly for more practical clothing that would allow freedom of movement and easier management of bodily functions. These reformers faced ridicule and social ostracism. Women who wore rational dress or bloomer costumes were mocked in newspapers, caricatured in cartoons, and excluded from polite society. The fierce resistance to dress reform reveals how deeply invested Victorian society was in maintaining women's restrictive clothing. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about maintaining a social order that depended on women's physical constraint and dependence. The elaborate difficulties of managing basic bodily functions in fashionable dress weren't bugs in the system. They were features, designed to keep women ornamental and controllable. The medical establishment played its part in this system of control. The doctors who treated Victorian women's health problems, the urinary infections, the digestive issues, the fainting spells caused by tight corsets, rarely connected these symptoms to the clothing that caused them. Instead, they attributed women's ill health to inherent feminine weakness, to delicate constitutions that required rest and seclusion. Women were prescribed bed rest and tonics when what they really needed was the freedom to breathe, move, and manage their bodily functions without elaborate difficulty. As the Victorian era progressed into its final decades, fashion began to change, though slowly and against significant resistance. The extreme crinolines of the 1860s gave way to narrower silhouettes, though the bustles of the 1870s and 1880s presented their own challenges. By the 1890s, the more streamlined Gibson girl look emerged, with simpler skirts and less restrictive undergarments. These changes came partly from women's own resistance to impractical fashion, partly from the rise of more active lifestyles, including bicycling and sports, and partly from the early feminist movements that challenged traditional constraints on women's lives. But the changes came slowly, and many women spent their entire lives navigating the daily challenges of restrictive dress, accepting physical discomfort and elaborate inconvenience as simply the price of being female, in a world that valued their appearance over their humanity. The legacy of Victorian attitudes toward women's bodies and bodily functions extends far beyond the era itself. The expectation that women should endure discomfort for beauty, that femininity requires constraint and difficulty, that women's bodily needs should be invisible and unspoken, these ideas persist in various forms today. Modern women still wear uncomfortable shoes, restrictive undergarments, and clothing that limits movement in the name of fashion and femininity. The Victorian woman in her magnificent crinoline, struggling to use a chamber pot while maintaining her dignity and social standing, represents something larger than a historical curiosity. She embodies the ongoing tension between how society wants women to appear and how women actually exist as physical beings with bodies that require care, attention, and accommodation. Her daily struggle with the most basic human needs reveals the profound disconnect between the idealized image of femininity, ethereal, decorative, somehow above earthly concerns, and the messy reality of being human in a physical body. The elaborate engineering required just to use the toilet shows us how far a society will go to maintain beautiful illusions, even when those illusions cause genuine suffering to the people forced to embody them. As we look back at the Victorian era from our modern perspective, we can see clearly how the constraints of fashion and etiquette served to limit women's freedom and autonomy. The beautiful gowns were cages, the social rules were chains, and the daily struggle with basic bodily functions was a constant reminder of powerlessness in the face of systems designed by others for others' benefit. Yet we can also see the resilience, ingenuity, and quiet resistance of the women who lived within these constraints. They found ways to survive, to maintain dignity, to support each other, and eventually to demand change. Their struggles paved the way for the freedoms that modern women take for granted: the freedom to move, to work, to travel, to exist in public spaces without elaborate preparation and constant anxiety about bodily needs. The question we must ask ourselves is not just about Victorian women, but about our own time. What constraints do we accept as normal? What discomforts do we endure for the sake of appearance or social acceptance? What prices do we pay for conforming to expectations that may not serve our best? Interests? The specifics have changed, but the underlying dynamics persist in ways both obvious and subtle. The Victorian woman's struggle to use the toilet in her enormous dress seems almost absurdly difficult from our modern perspective. But it represents something profound about the human cost of social systems that prioritize appearance over function, control over freedom, beautiful illusions over uncomfortable truths. Every woman who carefully managed her crinoline, who held her bladder for hours to avoid social embarrassment, who developed health problems from restrictive clothing, was paying a personal price for a social system that valued her as an ornament rather than as a complete human being. The stories that weren't told, the struggles that weren't recorded, the daily indignities that were considered too vulgar to mention, these absences in the historical record tell us as much as the documented facts. What a society chooses not to discuss, what it renders invisible through shame and silence, reveals what it finds threatening or uncomfortable about human reality. Breaking that silence, recovering these hidden stories, allows us to see past the elegant surface of history to the human experiences beneath. The Victorian woman in her magnificent dress, performing elaborate acrobatics just to answer nature's call, reminds us that behind every beautiful image lies a more complex and often more difficult reality, and that understanding that reality is essential to understanding ourselves. Was the wealth and elegance of the Victorian era worth the suffering it required, particularly from women? The question has no simple answer, but it forces us to consider what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice for beauty or status or social acceptance, and whose suffering we're willing to ignore or minimize in pursuit of aesthetic ideals. The Victorian woman's daily battle with her own biology, fought in silence and secrecy, stands as a testament to both human endurance and the terrible costs of systems that deny basic humanity in service of impossible ideals. If this journey into the hidden, uncomfortable realities of Victorian life has changed how you see those elegant period dramas and romantic historical images, if you now notice the weight of those dresses and wonder about the women inside them, then you've begun to understand history not as a series of beautiful tableaux, but as the lived experience of real people facing real challenges with remarkable courage and ingenuity. The next time you see a Victorian lady in a museum painting or a period film, remember the chamber pot hidden behind the screen, the split drawers beneath the silk, and the daily heroism required simply to exist with dignity in a world designed to make such existence as difficult as possible. What aspect of this hidden history surprised you most? The open crotch underwear, the portable chamber pots, the deadly crinoline fires, or the sheer physical endurance required for basic social functions? The Victorian era's beautiful surfaces concealed struggles that reveal as much about power, control, and human resilience as any political event or technological innovation. In understanding how women manage the most intimate aspects of their daily lives, we understand something essential about how societies shape and constrain the people within them, and how those people find ways to survive, adapt, and eventually demand change.